Thank you for joining Jennifer Schauss and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can contact her directly at the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising, so you can send an email through this email for more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Devon Hewitt. She's going to be covering debriefs, why and how, understanding the timeline. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic. The reasons for having a debriefing or attending a debriefing or requesting a debriefing are varied. The conventional wisdom is that you ask for a debriefing or the government provides a debriefing because they want to give you an opportunity to improve the next go around, to improve your proposal. And you want to have that opportunity to learn what they consider to be flaws in your proposal or things you could have done better. Another reason to attend a debriefing is to learn about the evaluation, certainly the evaluation of your proposal, but what you can generally know about the evaluation in whole, and maybe something about the evaluation of the awardee. And the purpose of all that would be to consider filing a protest. So if there's a sense right away that somehow the contract award that you learn about is not fair or makes sense or rational, a debriefing, in theory, gives you the opportunity to fish for information that would either allay your concerns or indicate that indeed something went wrong. Those two are two of purposes. If you are considering a protest, timing is key. And there are a number of different timelines and a number of different due dates that are important. The things to remember with regard to these timelines is that it is different for DoD agencies now, there's a new development, than it is for civilian agencies. There is also a difference between a required, quote-unquote, debriefing and a brief explanation or an informal debriefing. There's also a varied definitions of days. There are calendar days, and then there are business days. And then there are also timelines for filing a protest at GAO, Government Accountability Office, and being timely in that regard, and filing a protest at GAO to get a CICA stay. And that is a stay of contract performance under the contract award while the protest is pending. And that allows sort of to hold keep the status quo while the protest is proceeding, and therefore allows an agency to be more inclined to follow recommendations that the GAO gives. Next slide. The most important thing about a debriefing, if you want one, and why wouldn't you, is to request one in writing within 3 days. That is the first most important timing due date. Now, an agency can either provide a pre-award debriefing or a post-award debriefing. A pre-award debriefing occurs when an offeror is excluded from, quote-unquote, the competitive range. And the competitive range is established, generally speaking, in a negotiated procurement, where there's an ongoing procurement, and the government decides that after reviewing the initial proposal, they are going to go out and ask questions or hold discussions or negotiations with offerors regarding the questions that they had in the proposal or certain weaknesses or deficiencies that they believe the offeror needs to correct in order to make the proposal more competitive. But the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which governs federal procurements, allows an agency to narrow the field of the competitive range to an amount that's efficient. So in some procurements, there might be a submission of 50 offerors on some of these massive GWACs, or there might be only 8 offerors submitting bids. But in any event, depending on the context of the procurement, the government has discretion to narrow the competitive range, and that may require the exclusion of some offerors. And typically, they exclude offerors that they believe are really not in line for award, even if discussions were conducted with the offerors. At that point in time, an offeror can request a debriefing and be debriefed on the reasons for the exclusion. So that's what a pre-award debriefing is. A post-award debriefing is what it sounds like. It's a debriefing that's given offerors, and it can be given both disappointed offerors and the offeror who ultimately receives the contract, post-contract award. Now, the agency is not required to provide debriefings in every type of procurement. They are required to provide them in what's known as FAR Part 15 procurements, which is a negotiated procurement for a contract award. They are not required to provide debriefings in task order procurements. For example, task order competitions under Federal Supply Schedule, Multiple Award Schedule, GSA Schedule contracts. And with respect to other IDIQ contracts awarded pursuant to FAR Part 16, the government is only required to give debriefings in task order procurements above $5.5 million. So that is the universe of what's called, quote unquote, required debriefings. Next slide. Let's go on to the next slide. I apologize, there's some repetition here. Next slide. Okay, so to trigger the quote-unquote required debriefing, the first and most important thing is to make a written request for a debriefing. And a written request can be an email. And most importantly, when we're talking about timelines, is that request is made within 3 calendar days of an offeror's receipt of notice of its exclusion from the competitive range or notice of the agency's contract award. Now, typically, an agency is supposed to provide notice of the contract award within 3 days of the actual contract award. But that does create a nuance regarding timing, because some timing requirements start upon contract award and therefore prior to when you may receive notice. With respect to a pre-award debriefing, an agency can delay it until after award. And if they decide to do that, there's really no remedy or protest option to challenge that decision. But you also have a choice to either request for an instant debriefing once you're excluded from the competitive range or delay the debriefing upon contract award. I would recommend not delaying the debriefing, because as you'll see as we go through this topic, there are certain triggers for other timelines that are very important with regard to a protest. So it's really important to have the information right away Otherwise, if you delay it, the Government Accountability Office or another protest forum, the Court of Federal Claims, may find that that protest is not timely. The FAR requires an agency, to the maximum practical extent, to provide an offeror a post-award debriefing within 5 calendar days of its request. And what I see happening more in the bid protest field is that the government is giving a notice of award together with a written debriefing. But that's not true across the government. So you may make a request and there may be some time before an agency comes back and says, we'll give you an in-person debriefing, either in person or they might suggest a conference call. The agency has discretion to choose the form of the debriefing. So it could be written, it could be held on a conference call, or it could be in person. Now, if an offeror fails to make the written request within the 3-day period, the agency has the discretion to hold the debriefing in any event. I'm not sure that they would have an incentive to do so, but they are permitted to do so. Next slide. If you're not contemplating a protest, the following deadlines, timeframes that I'm going to discuss are really not relevant. The only timeline that's relevant for a debriefing where you just want to learn how to improve is the 3-day written deadline. The rest of the deadlines and timeframes I'm going to talk about are important for various aspects of a protest. And in that regard, I'm really talking about a protest at the Government Accountability Office. These timelines do not officially apply to another protest forum, which is the Court of Federal Claims. But if you delay too long before going into the Court of Federal Claims, there could be an issue with timeliness. As I mentioned, most debriefings in the more sophisticated agencies, and certainly in DoD, are occurring when they're through a written debriefing. There's a notice of award, and either the written debriefing is attached or it comes at some point later. This causes a problem with regard to when the debriefing ends. And the reason for that is that the FAR requires the agency to provide responses to reasonable questions provided by offerors. Now, if you're on a conference call or you're in person, you can have a back and forth and you can ask questions, and then once the debriefing's ended, it's concluded. And that is the first day or the trigger for another time frame that's important in a protest. But if you don't have a firm ending of the debriefing, then the issue is, well, when should you file your protest? And the protest timeframes and deadlines I'm talking about are the two I referred to earlier. The first is whether or not you want to get into the GAO, timeliness, and whether or not you want to get a seek a stay. If you want to get a seek a stay, and most offerors do, you have to file your protest at the GAO within 5 calendar days following the debriefing, or 10 calendar days following the date of the contract award, whichever is later. So notice that the 10-day window starts upon contract award, but keep in mind that you may not get notice until 3 days after contract award. And if the 5 calendar days starts to run from the conclusion of the debriefing, and you get a written debriefing from a civilian agency, they should allow you to submit follow-up questions. But does that mean the 5-day calendar day time frame starts to run? The Government Accountability Office has held that unless there is a quote-unquote clear indication that the government is allowing the debriefing to remain open, your 5 days starts to run the moment you received the debriefing. That's the trigger. Next slide. So I think the bottom line is that when in doubt, if you receive a written debriefing, ask for a confirmation in writing that the agency is going to keep the debriefing open. If they don't even answer the question, just file after the 5 calendar days after the debriefing, just to be safe. Now, there are occasions where the government will delay the debriefing for whatever reason or can't schedule it till later, and you've got the 10 calendar days. Although it says it's the later of, you have to think about another deadline, and that other deadline is timeliness. And that's also a 10-day window. And timeliness tracks back to the moment the offeror knew or should have known the grounds for the protest. Now, typically an offeror is going to learn the grounds for the protest pursuant to a debriefing. But in certain respects, an offeror could know 1 or 2 grounds of a protest upon notification of contract award. For example, if the contract award is given to a contractor that, yesterday on the cover of the Washington Post was considered to, be debarred or fraud or some sort of notice that would make them completely ineligible for award, then your 10-day clock would start. As an aside, if you're a small business and considering a small business protest, once you receive the notification of apparent successful offeror, you have 5 business days to file a protest challenging the status or size of that offeror, and that's an independent time frame from the time frame for requesting a debriefing or the time frame for filing a timely protest at the GAO or the time frame for filing a protest within time frames to achieve a CICA stay. Next slide. It's different for the Department of Defense. There was a study conducted by the nonprofit organization RAND that DoD funded. And the topic of the study was debriefings and bid protests and the process. And one of the findings of the study was that one of the reasons offerors or disappointed offerors file protests is because they don't get information in debriefing and they filed the protest to get information. So subsequent to that study and pursuant to the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2018, the Department of Defense issued a memorandum called Enhanced Post-Award Debriefing Rights, and that was effective March 2nd of last year. And the purpose of that was to provide more opportunities for offerors to ask questions and also to provide more information to offerors. Now, it only applies with DoD procurements, and it does not apply in certain acquisitions. Commercial items, simplified acquisitions, GSA schedule, and sealed bidding. So essentially, it applies in the same context that civilian required debriefing are held. Next slide. So the timelines are as follows in the context of a DoD debriefing. If the agency has provided a required debriefing, and recall that a required debriefing is only required if it's triggered by the 3-day written request and it falls within the task order excess of $5.5 million or a contract award, an offeror is allowed to ask questions within 2 business days following receipt of the written debriefing. And DoD must respond to these questions within 5 business days. So you've got business days here, and you've got 2 and 5. The debriefing now is considered concluded upon the offeror's receipt of DoD's responses. So once it's concluded, that starts the 5-day CICA window. And depending on the information you learn in the debriefing, or you learned or should have known upon contract award, the conclusion of the debriefing could start the 10-day timeliness window as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that the 5-day CICA stay count starts upon the conclusion of the offeror's receipt, not at the conclusion of the 5 business days in which DoD has the ability to respond to questions. Next slide. So for a DoD procurement, the 5 calendar CICA day clock starts not after notice of award, but actually after receipt of the written debriefing if the offeror is not going to submit questions. For a DoD procurement, the 5 calendar day clock starts after the offeror's receipt of agency answers to offeror questions. And for a civilian procurement, the 5 CICA calendar date clock starts after the conclusion of the debriefing, but really who knows when exactly it's concluded. And the 10 calendar day clock is still in force for the timeliness if you're going to file at court at the Government Accountability Office. And of course, that runs parallel to the CICA clock. And sometimes they intertwine and sometimes they don't. And again, in DoD, you've got that timeline, and that's using business days versus calendar days, and you still have the parallel CICA clock and the timeliness clock. So those are how the timelines interact. Next slide. The best practice is to make a written request for debriefing and any procurement right away. In FAR Part A procurements, GSA schedule procurements, and simplified acquisitions, the government's supposed to give you a brief explanation, and it is indeed brief. Now, that doesn't matter. You could still ask for a debriefing, and they may clarify that, well, they can't give you a debriefing. It's not necessary, but they'll give you a brief explanation. And then you never know if an agency is going to actually give you a debriefing, whether or not it's required or not. So in every procurement, ask for a debriefing and do it immediately, or certainly within the 3 calendar days. If you receive a debriefing and it's written, ask questions. I mean, if you have them, and most likely you will. I mean, the debriefings are quite skeletal for a lot of reasons. So always ask questions, and if it's civilian, try to determine in writing whether that means the debriefing is going to be held open. And in a DoD, you've got the memo as a guide. And again, the 3-day time frame in which to request a debriefing is important for getting the debriefing, no matter what your status or strategy is. The 5 and 10-day rule for CICA stay and timeliness, those are only relevant if you are contemplating a protest, and particularly if you're contemplating a protest at the Government Accountability Office. So 3 days applies for debriefings generally. The 5 and 10, the calendar versus business day, DoD versus civilian, is important if you're contemplating a protest. That's it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And hopefully you learned something about debriefings from this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, you can contact her at the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.